The bus swayed slightly as it stopped at the station. The sound of the door opening cut through the stifling silence of the late afternoon. Traffic was heavy, the faces of the passengers tired, and no one seemed to care much who was getting on or off. No one except the driver, Robert Whitman. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, his eyes analyzing each passenger climbing the steps. That's when he saw him. Chuck Norris, with his iconic beard and commanding presence, slowly boarded, holding on to the handrail. At 70 years old, Chuck Norris was a man who had faced many things in life, but nothing could prepare him for what was about to happen. He paid the fare with a small, polite smile, nodded to the driver, and turned to find a seat. But before he could take the first step, Whitman's harsh voice resonated through the bus. "Hey, mister, the back of the bus is empty. I think that seat is more appropriate for you." Chuck Norris frowned and looked at the driver, confused. Some passengers raised their heads. The silence grew thicker. "Excuse me?" Chuck asked, maintaining his composure. The driver crossed his arms and nodded towards the back of the vehicle. "You heard me, old man. The back of the bus has more space. These seats up front are priority." Chuck Norris took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling slowly. He looked at the empty seats near him, clearly available. "Priority for whom?" His voice was calm but sharp. Whitman smiled, but it was a humorless smile, the smile of someone used to being in control. "Look, I don't have time to argue. Either you go to the back of the bus or you can turn around and leave." The passengers exchanged nervous glances. The air seemed to grow heavier. A young man at the back of the bus discreetly raised his phone and began recording. Chuck Norris maintained his upright posture, firmly gripping his cane, and without raising his voice, said just 3 words: "I won't go." The driver straightened up, surprised by the response. His tone changed from condescending to irritated. "What did you say?" "I said I won't go. I've paid my fare. I have the right to sit wherever I want." The silence on the bus grew even deeper. Now, no one else was distracted by their own problems. Everyone was paying attention. Whitman's face turned red with anger. "So, you think you can defy my orders? You think you can do whatever you want on my bus?" Chuck Norris didn't back down. His gaze was firm, the same expression he had used so many times in life when someone tried to belittle him. And at that moment, he realized something. There are situations where staying silent is the worst choice. Situations where if you don't know how to position yourself, you'll be crushed by the world around you. Unfortunately, many have gone through moments like this and didn't know how to react. Knowing how to defend yourself, how to demand respect, and fight for your dignity is essential. Whitman moved towards the radio. His hand trembled with irritation. "Calling security. We have a passenger causing disturbances on the bus." The young man who was recording smiled discreetly. He knew this wasn't going to end well for the driver, and he was right. In 3 minutes, Robert Whitman's life would change completely. The bus remained stopped in the middle of the street, obstructing traffic. The roar of the engine mixed with the impatient honking from outside, but inside the vehicle, the silence was dense. The driver, Robert Whitman, held the radio tightly, his hand trembling slightly as he waited for a response from Central. Sweat began to form on his forehead, but he refused to yield. Chuck Norris, on the other hand, remained motionless, holding his cane as if it were a scepter. His gaze was firm, calm. He wasn't fazed by Whitman's glare or the murmur around him. At 70 years old, he had faced much worse situations than this. "Can you tell me exactly what rule I'm breaking?" Chuck asked, his voice firm but without hostility. Whitman snorted impatiently. "Don't try to lecture me, old man. I've already told you these seats are priority." "Yes, and I'm a 70-year-old man. If anyone has the right to these seats, it's me." The passengers looked at each other, some frowning, others starting to murmur among themselves. It was clear to everyone that Chuck hadn't done anything wrong. The young man who was filming everything suppressed a nervous laugh. The scene was so absurd it seemed surreal. "Look, the driver wants to call security to remove an old man from his own seat," said the young man, raising his phone a bit higher to better capture the scene. The radio crackled, and the voice of the security central resonated in the bus. "Confirm the driver sending an officer to the scene." Whitman let out a satisfied smile and crossed his arms, thinking he had control. Chuck Norris didn't react, remaining seated without showing any sign of concern. But the passengers began to grow restless. A lady sitting across the aisle shook her head and crossed her arms. "This is absurd. The gentleman has paid for his ticket like any other passenger." A man in a suit who until then had been busy with his laptop looked up and finally spoke up. "Exactly. No one should be forced out of their seat without reason." Whitman looked around, realizing the situation was starting to slip out of his control. Do you really want to get involved in this? This is none of your business. But it was too late. Solidarity was growing inside the bus. More and more passengers were taking a stand. If we let this happen now, what's to stop it from happening again tomorrow? This isn't right, added an older man. He has the right to sit wherever he wants. Chuck Norris smiled inwardly. He already knew the problem wasn't just with him. What Whitman didn't realize was that his attitude wasn't just affecting one man, but was bringing to light a bigger issue that many were tired of ignoring. The sound of sirens began to approach. Whitman turned to Chuck Norris, crossing his arms arrogantly. Let's see if you're still so confident when security arrives. But Whitman had no idea that in a few minutes, everything would crumble for him, because the real problem wasn't Chuck Norris, it was himself. The atmosphere inside the bus was tense. Passengers exchanged looks of indignation. The young man who was filming everything continued to record the scene, and Chuck Norris remained firm. The bus doors opened with a hiss, and a security agent from the transport company entered. He was a robust man with a tired expression, as if he had already dealt with situations like this before. Whitman immediately pointed at Chuck Norris. This guy is causing trouble and refuses to follow the rules. The guard looked at Chuck Norris, then at the passengers, and finally at Whitman. What exactly has he done? Asked the agent, crossing his arms. The driver hesitated for a moment. He won't go to the back of the bus. I've asked him several times, and he refuses to obey. The guard frowned, confused. And why should he go to the back? Whitman realized he now had a problem. Because these seats are priority. The guard looked at Chuck Norris again, noticing the cane by his side. He took a deep breath and turned to the driver. He's an elderly man. If anyone has the right to sit here, it's him. The passengers began to murmur in agreement. The driver tried to argue. He shouldn't be here. But he couldn't finish the sentence. The guard stepped forward and spoke clearly for everyone to hear. Mr. Norris, are you all right? Chuck Norris smiled slightly. Yes, I'm fine, thank you. I'm just trying to understand why this driver wants to remove me from my seat. The guard turned to Whitman. Driver, did you really stop the bus in the middle of the street to try to remove an elderly man from a priority seat? Silence weighed heavily inside the vehicle. The passengers waited anxiously for the response. The young man with the phone smiled and continued recording. Whitman was left speechless. The guard sighed. I think the one causing problems here isn't him. The passengers erupted in murmurs of approval. Whitman was cornered, and the worst was yet to come. Sometimes all we need is a new perspective to face challenges like this. In the first pinned comment, you'll find material that can help you transform difficulties into strength. The silence inside the bus was absolute. Everyone was waiting for Whitman's reaction, who for the first time didn't seem so sure of himself. The guard was still looking at him, waiting for an explanation that wouldn't come. Chuck Norris, for his part, remained seated, calm as if he knew this would happen all along. The passengers began to stir again. So, you mean he hasn't done anything wrong? Asked a woman sitting near the door. Of course not, said the man in the suit. He has every right to be in that seat. The one causing the problem is the driver. The guard sighed, visibly irritated at having been called to deal with something so absurd. He looked at Whitman again. Driver, do you have any valid explanation for having stopped the bus and called security to remove an elderly man from his seat? Whitman opened his mouth to respond, but closed it again. He knew that anything he said at that moment would only worsen his situation. I was just following protocols, he responded, his voice sounding much less confident than before. The guard crossed his arms. What protocol requires an elderly person to give up their seat to someone younger? Whitman looked around, realizing that no one there was on his side. He swallowed hard, feeling the heat of the passengers' gaze on him. From the back of the bus, someone shouted, "Fire that guy! This is absurd!" Others began to agree, their voices rising. "He has to pay for this! This has to end! That man just wants to go home in peace!" The situation was getting out of control for Whitman. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, breathing with difficulty. He tried to find support from some passenger, but no one seemed willing to defend him. And then the young man. The young man who was recording spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. Well, I've already posted the video. I think the transport company will have a lot to explain. Whitman turned quickly, his eyes wide. You've posted what? The young man smiled. The video of you trying to expel Chuck Norris from his own seat. And it already has thousands of views. Whitman's indignation was replaced by sheer panic. His face paled as he realized his action was already exposed to the world. The passengers began to murmur again, now even more animated. Many took out their phones and started checking the video that was spreading rapidly. Chuck Norris, who had remained silent until then, smiled slightly. It seems the truth always finds a way to come to light. The guard picked up the radio and spoke to the central office. Security here. It seems we have a more serious situation. We need a supervisor immediately. Whitman shook his head as if trying to deny reality. I didn't do anything wrong. I was just... But he couldn't finish. The bus stopped again, this time because an official car from the transport company arrived. A man in a suit got out quickly, his expression loaded with seriousness. He entered the bus and immediately assessed the situation. What's going on here? The guard pointed at Whitman. The driver stopped the bus to try to remove Chuck Norris from a priority seat. The man in the suit looked at Whitman in disbelief. Is this true? Whitman stammered, trying to invent some excuse. I thought he was causing trouble. The man in the suit sighed and rubbed his face, visibly frustrated. You know there's already a video of this circulating on the internet, right? Whitman froze. What? It's all over social media. We've received an avalanche of messages demanding a response. The young man who was recording waved his phone in the air. And this is just the beginning. The supervisor looked around, observing the faces of the passengers. Does anyone here think the driver was right? The bus remained silent. Can anyone confirm that he was unfair to this gentleman? Several hands went up at the same time. The supervisor sighed and turned to Whitman. Get off the bus, now! Whitman's eyes widened. What? I'm the driver! I'm in charge here! The supervisor didn't flinch. Not anymore. You're suspended until further notice. The passengers began to applaud as Whitman, furious, tried to argue. You can't do this to me. I've been working here for years. And apparently that's been your biggest mistake, said the supervisor. Whitman stood still for a moment, his face red with rage, but he knew he had no choice. Slowly, he gathered his things and got off the bus, still being booed by the passengers. The supervisor looked at Chuck Norris. Sir, I'm very sorry for what happened. This driver doesn't represent our company. Chuck Norris smiled slightly. I hope you ensure this doesn't happen to anyone else. The supervisor nodded. We'll do everything possible to change this situation. The young man who recorded the video approached Chuck Norris and smiled. You've just made history. Chuck Norris looked at him and patted the boy on the shoulder. I just did what anyone should do. But he knew that from that moment on, things would never be the same. Don't wait until it's too late to learn to defend yourself. The material in the first pinned comment can make a difference. Secure yours now before it runs out. The bus finally started moving again, but the atmosphere inside had completely changed. What was once an environment of tension and silence was now charged with a sense of justice. The passengers exchanged looks of complicity, still assimilating what they had just witnessed. Chuck Norris, still sitting in the same place, looked out the window and sighed. He didn't want to be the center of attention, but he knew this situation could mean something bigger. The young man who had recorded everything approached again, now with a more animated tone. Have you seen how this video is exploding? Chuck Norris smiled slightly. Honestly, I never imagined something like this would attract so much attention. The young man laughed. Well, look, hundreds of comments supporting you. People are outraged by what happened. The driver has lost everything because of his arrogance. Chuck Norris shook his head slowly. It wasn't about him losing his job, son. It was about doing the right thing. Those people always think they can step on others without consequences, but there comes a time when things change. The young woman sitting further ahead turned and joined the conversation. The gentleman is right. Sometimes we stay quiet out of fear of causing problems, but if no one says anything, this never changes. Other passengers nodded. The man in the suit who had remained silent before cleared his throat before speaking. I'm ashamed to say this, but when I saw what was happening, I hesitated. I thought about not getting involved, not looking for trouble. But when I saw the gentleman keeping calm, resisting, I realized that doing nothing is the same as accepting it. Chuck Norris looked at him and smiled kindly. The important thing is that in the end, you did the right thing. That's what counts. The bus continued on its way, but Chuck Norris knew that the story that had happened inside wouldn't end there. In the following days, the video went completely viral. News outlets began to cover the case, and debates about discrimination and respect flooded social media. The transport company issued a public apology and announced a new training policy for all employees, ensuring that situations like this would not happen again. Whitman tried to defend himself, but there was no excuse sufficient to erase what had happened. The pressure from the media was too great, and his career in public transport ended there. And Chuck Norris continued his life as always, but now when he walked down the street, some people recognized him and greeted him. Many saw him as a symbol of resistance, an example that no one should accept being treated as less. One ordinary morning while waiting at the bus stop, a young man approached and said, "Thank you for what you did that day. You've taught me that dignity has no price." Chuck Norris smiled, looking at the approaching bus. "Believe me, son, it never does." He got on the bus and chose his seat in the front, as he had always done. But this time, no one dared to say a word. Has this story made you reflect? Then don't forget to subscribe to the channel to keep seeing more inspiring stories like this. Your support makes a difference. Oh, and tell me in the comments, have you lived through or witnessed something similar? Let's talk.